I'll start by saying that I absolutely love the Indiana Jones movies, with The Last Crusade being my personal favourite from childhood well into adulthood. A lot of the wit and charm of these films has aged beautifully over the years, with fantastic performances from Harrison Ford and a memorable cast of characters, and the natural banger that is John Williams' score, all mixed with a near perfect balance of the slapstick and the serious, come together to create 3 films that are damn near perfect. It's a series I could truly watch over and over again. The magic of these films is difficult to capture. It's something not even the 4th or the 5th film in the franchise could successfully do. Even with original talent involvement, they still fell short of what made the original 3 so special. I have enough to say about the 4th and 5th movies to make at least 2 full-length videos, but I will briefly use them to say this. After finishing Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, it has now become clear that the future of this franchise is no longer in movies, it's in games, just like this one. And with that, let's take a look at Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. Taking place 1 year after the events of Raiders of the Lost Ark, as Indiana Jones, we will travel the globe in search of a stolen artifact. The journey will take us to the reclusive streets of the Vatican City, the scorching hot deserts of Egypt, the high altitudes of the Himalayas, and many more historical places from around the globe, all to unravel the mysteries of the Great Circle and the power it holds. Naturally, Indiana isn't alone in doing this. Joining him is a cast of supporting characters, like Gina, a reporter on a personal mission to find her sister, Locus, a physically imposing zealot on a mission to protect the secrets of the Great Circle. And then running against Indiana, we have the classic enemy of the fascists, led by Dr. Voss, a German archaeologist hellbent on using the power of the Great Circle to drive the German war machine towards the goal of world domination. First thing I'll talk about is arguably Machine Games' most decisive design choice, and that's the interesting mix of first-person and third-person camera perspectives they deploy throughout the game. Initially, I was uncertain how this would work without you as the player wanting exclusively one or the other, but in practice, it works extremely well. The first-person perspective puts you boots on the ground as Indiana Jones, while the third-person camera is deployed for the larger aspects of the game, such as swinging across a ravine, scaling a wall, or interacting with elements of a large-scale puzzle. It makes these elements a bit more cinematic. Personally, I think if it were exclusively in first person, certain aspects would be a little tedious, especially these traversal elements. While if it were strictly in third person, it could potentially lose some of that interactivity that you get with the first person view, such as environment interactions, combat, and smaller puzzle interactions as well. Instead of committing to just one perspective, they made it an interesting balancing act, and it's one that actually works remarkably well. I can't really see a fault with it. However, it wouldn't shock me if Machine Games followed the example of games such as Resident Evil Village, which eventually updated with an option for a purely third-person mode. When it was announced that Machine Games would be developing a new Indiana Jones game, I had one thought: this makes a lot of sense. After all, if anyone can make a game about beating the life out of fascists and in a remarkably satisfying way, it's probably the guys who made a name for themselves doing exactly that. This makes the direction they took with Indiana Jones all the more surprising, but also quite refreshing. Don't get me wrong, there are certainly elements of that which Machine Games is best known for, but if you go into this expecting it to be a Wolfenstein game with an Indiana Jones skin on it, you'll be disappointed. Actually, if I had to compare The Great Circle to any other game, it'd actually be closer to the recent Hitman games, especially with how its mechanics surrounding stealth, disguises, and even its level layouts work. Indiana Jones and The Great Circle's gameplay is all about investigation, whether that be of a clandestine nature, where we take the disguise of a fascist, a worker in the desert, or a priest. The idea is to stay under the radar as you peruse the area, looking for your next lead. Or, as I mentioned before, this is Machine Games, you could attempt to Wolfenstein your way through it, making a sport out of mowing down as many fascists as possible. Well, that is indeed fun. It's not the most fulfilling way to play this game. Not to mention that it can sometimes be a very challenging way to play. I wouldn't call combat the focus of this game, but that doesn't mean it's not really fun when it happens, especially with the sheer amount of improvised weapons Indiana can take advantage of, from a sledgehammer to a shower brush. Anything in his hands is a lethal weapon. As well as this, I loved how they incorporate the whip in the combat, with how you can pull enemies towards you and deliver blows with sound effects ripped straight out of the original films, as in unnecessarily loud, sounding a bit like a gunshot, and leaving you wondering how no one else heard that. Combat, depending on how you play, can be avoided for large parts of a game if you really want to. Come to think of it, I didn't actually fire a gun until the very end of the Vatican level, and that was around 5 hours in. On the subject of guns, it's clear gunplay was not at the forefront of the combat. Instead, it's presented more like a last resort for the cornered player, which I'm actually happy about. I feel like this lack of focus on a more shoot-'em-up style of gameplay encourages the player to find more creative methods of engaging enemies, much like how Indiana would try to do it in the movies. With this and the general lack of heavy combat arenas found in the game, much like its interesting first and third person hybrid perspectives, it helps to set it apart from other games based around other iconic treasure hunters. It's clear it's aiming to do something completely different and new. The downtime between the large-scale action set pieces makes it all the more enjoyable and slightly chaotic when it finally does kick in, such as the section in the Himalayas, where our investigation of a displaced German warship ends with us fleeing a war-torn China, all the while engaging in low-altitude dogfights with Japanese fighter planes. Machine Games understood that while punching fascists absolutely was an element of the Indiana Jones IP that people do enjoy, it is not where its focus was. The focus of Indiana Jones is in its mysteries. Indiana Jones, at its core, is all about solving ancient mysteries, taking the form of riddles or puzzles that, once solved or activated, more often than not give way to a comically large trap. It's literally the heart and soul of the franchise. When it came to how the Great Circle handles this vital element of the franchise identity, I'm thoroughly pleased with what they've managed to achieve. If anything, the puzzles are the best part of the game. It's in these sections you realise that the team behind them clearly did their homework. Not only this, but I found myself constantly impressed with how varied and remarkably detailed all these puzzles were, effectively utilising the imagery and the feel of their setting, such as the Vatican, where the puzzles lean into Catholic symbolism, while the pyramids of Giza reflect the lost majesty of an ancient Egypt. The thrill of delving into the depths of these long-forgotten crypts, solving their puzzles, and then a door cracking open after centuries of inactivity genuinely never got old. At one point, I was pacing around a puzzle area, going over the notes I'd gathered in my journal and fully talking to myself. Look, I've tried to avoid this statement in a lot of my reviews, as it's traditionally clowned on, but at this point, I simply cannot avoid saying it. This is where the immersion was at its peak, and it truly felt like I was Indiana Jones. I reworded it so you can't clown on me now. In terms of these puzzles' difficulty, I wouldn't call any of them particularly difficult. Sometimes they do require an element of thinking to them, but for those who prefer the God of War approach to puzzles, wherein the characters essentially tell you how to solve it all after about 5 seconds, fear not, it's got that too. Except this time, it's a purely optional feature that will not annoy players looking for a more traditional challenge. When it comes to the story of Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, the writers had an uphill battle from the very beginning when adapting such an iconic film property to game form in a way that hadn't been done in previous attempts. After successfully evoking the look and the feel of the original films, Machine Games also did a fantastic job of creating a compelling and enjoyable adventure that takes major plot beats from its predecessors. In a nutshell, there's an artifact of immense power, the fascists want it, Indiana fights the fascists, he wins. Now, that's a dramatic oversimplification of the plot, and upon first hearing that, especially if you've seen the films, you may think this narrative is disappointing. But I'd argue it's where the franchise is at its best, when it sticks to its roots. The writers of The Great Circle understood what made the original films so enjoyable and successfully translated the elements of these films to full effect, crafting a story that, while it feels like a greatest hits of the films that came before, it's still remarkably enjoyable and so good that it is actually now my third favourite Indiana Jones story. The story is brought to life by an incredible mix of voice and motion capture performances, with Troy Baker, surprising absolutely no one, delivering a fantastic but genuinely uncanny Harrison Ford impression that isn't just skin deep. If you had told me it was actually Ford who lent his voice to the game, I would have believed you. I was also a huge fan of Mario Scavrili's performance as German scientist Emmerich Voss, the game's primary villain. He simultaneously gave the character both a surface-level menace as well as the ability to make him look like an absolute clown, blinded by his own god complex and blind fanaticism to the cause. So you could say the performance was very true to how real-life fascists operate. And last but not least, I will always praise the late Tony Todd, aka the man with the single most intimidating voice ever, who delivers a fantastic performance as the giant Locust, a member of a religious sect who guards the secrets of the Great Circle against prying eyes, including Indiana's, and will even fight giant snakes and run head-on into gunfire to protect the secrets of his ancestors. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle surprised me by doing something totally unexpected, something that, historically, I'm an absolute sucker for: surprise horror elements. Even better, every time it did this, it somehow pinpointed and played on my worst fears: the dark, liminal spaces, and, however you pronounce this one, big things in water. Don't like. To start, let's talk about what happens in Egypt. Indiana finds himself in the aptly named Cave of Darkness, only to find that he is not alone and is soon actively pursued by a large, hulking figure, dead set on murdering him. Made all the worse by the sound of the clicking of the figure's mouth, cutting through the pitch black as he attempts to echolocate you, and the vast quantities of coins that when stepped on, lead him right to you. I'll just say the gameplay of this section I got is absolutely pathetic, as I genuinely panicked. The next time would arrive with the giant sea snake ripped straight out of myth, as well as the large, murky depths it inhabits, and the nippy underwater traversal that has you moving from cover to cover while staying out of open water for too long lest it catches you and eats you, as well as you having to monitor how much oxygen you have left. This is why I haven't touched games like Subnautica, and unfortunately never will. And the third and final time comes in a nightmare sequence, where Indiana wakes up at his desk back in his college office, and then proceeds through a repeating hallway that gradually breaks down around him, with grass and vines breaking through the walls. It's his two worlds colliding and threatening to break him apart at any moment. What's this, you might say? A repeating hallway where things get a little bit strange? Oh, this right here. This right here. This is my bread and butter. This is why I'm here. The game is full of surprising moments like this, but no others hit me as much as these intriguing instances of horror did. It's things like this that made the story incredibly memorable for all the right reasons. Across every point I've discussed in this review, the common theme that binds them is obvious, yet it can go completely unnoticed, from its characters to its environments to its story. That sounds like that KSI song. With its environments, its characters, and its story, they are all brought to life by an incredible level of attention to detail that had me in a constant state of awe. It's noticeable across nearly everything you see on screen, across the entire game, and its visuals are genuinely remarkable to admire. This is especially noticeable at the Vatican level, where they recreate various true historical landmarks, such as the Sistine Chapel and the Tower of Nicholas V. It's no wonder they pushed a camera mechanic. It gently nudges the player into seeing all these finer details and gives them an XP reward for doing so. Even the smallest of details were catered to in a meaningful way, such as consumables that change based on the region you're in. It's teeny tiny details like this where immersion is put first above everything and completely pays off. I will commend what Machine Games has done here. They took creative risks with many aspects of this game that I firmly believe paid off in the end. It would have been easy to make an Indiana Jones game that follows the formula of other games such as Uncharted and the Tomb Raider series, but straight away the Great Circle sets itself up not as something that is merely inspired by the original films, but something that is an outright extension of them. It takes its place in a franchise as one of its better entries, and I hope it's not the last we see of Machine Games' work on Indiana Jones, as what they've managed to achieve here is genuinely fantastic. And in the world of Indiana Jones, there are always more stories to tell, even if those stories are absolutely diabolical levels of awful. I mean, come on, I don't need to see my childhood heroes sad and depressed and old, and let me live in my nostalgia in peace. At least Kingdom of the Crystal Skull